The wind off the Judith Basin came early that September, carrying the smell of dry grass and coming snow. Clara Merritt stood at the fence line of her father's homestead, her homestead now, 3 years since the cholera took him, and watched the horizon the way a person does when they've learned not to expect anything from it. The morning chores were done. The 2 milk cows stood patient in the pen. The kitchen garden had been stripped and the root vegetables laid in the cellar, each one wrapped in burlap the way her mother had shown her before the fever took her too. Clara was 26 years old and she had buried both parents, kept 40 acres alive through 2 hard winters, and learned to shoe her own horse when no one else was near enough to help. She was not waiting for rescue. She had stopped waiting for that a long time ago. But some mornings, in the blue quiet before the sun crested the mountains, she let herself want something she couldn't name out loud. Eli Kane rode up the track just after 8, the way he did most weeks since his own spread bordered hers to the north. He was a big man, easy in the saddle, with the kind of face that looked like it had been left out in the weather, not unpleasant, just honest. He'd known Clara since they were children running barefoot to the trading post in Lewistown, and somewhere along the years the childhood ease between them had settled into something comfortable. Reliable. He swung down and tipped his hat. "Morning, Clara." "Eli." She didn't look up from the fence post she was examining. One of the rails had worked loose in the last wind. She'd get to it this afternoon. He leaned against the fence beside her, hat pushed back, squinting at the mountains. "Heard Denton's boy is asking after you," he said. There was a grin in his voice. "3rd time this year. Denton's boy is 19 years old and afraid of his own mule." Eli laughed. It was a good laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that had always made something shift in her chest. She kept her eyes on the fence post. "At this rate," he said, still grinning, still careless as a man who doesn't know what he's holding, "you'll never get married." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Clara straightened slowly. She looked at him, really looked, the way she almost never let herself, and she said it so quietly that the wind nearly took it. "Only if you ask me." Then she picked up the orange barn cat that had wound around her ankles, tucked him against her chest, and walked back toward the house. Eli stood at the fence post a long time after that. He didn't follow her that day. He told himself it was because he'd misheard. The wind had been up. She'd said something, probably something sharp and practical, the way Clara always was. Something like "only if I'm asked proper or only when it's worth my while." Something that made sense. He rode home and didn't think about it. He thought about it every hour for 3 days. The trouble with Eli Kane was not that he was a hard man or an unkind one. The trouble was that he had spent 31 years being easy about things, easy with neighbors, easy with hardship, easy with the long silences of a man who lives alone. He'd learned that ease as a boy when his father died crossing the Missouri and left his mother with 5 children and a soddy that leaked. You either went rigid and broke, or you went loose and bent. Eli had bent his whole life. But Clara was not something a man could be easy about. She never had been. He knew what she was. He'd watched her for years, the way she bartered for seed corn at Murphy's store, knowing the prices better than the storekeeper, the way she'd sat with old Hartley all through January when the man's lungs gave out, riding over every morning in weather that kept sensible people inside. He knew she kept a ledger of every dollar this land had cost and earned, and that she could tell you, to the penny, what 40 acres of Montana grass was worth in a bad year. She did not need him. That was the truth of it. Clara Merritt had built a life from loss and stubbornness, and it was a good life, and she had not built any space in it for someone like him. And yet, Only if you ask me. He sat on his porch in the cold evenings and turned those words over like a stone in his palm, looking for the side that made sense. The side that didn't stop his breath. He was afraid. Not of her, never of her. Afraid of the asking. Afraid that he'd misread a moment and would lose the one friendship that had kept him sane through his own winters. Afraid that if he spoke it out loud and was wrong, he'd have nothing left to ride toward on these long Montana mornings. He came back the following Tuesday with a new fence rail cut from his own timber, already measured to fit. Clara watched him from the kitchen window. She did not go out immediately. She let him work, because that was the honest thing. She wanted to see what he would do when he thought no one was watching. Eli Kane in an easy mood was all jokes and wide smiles. But she'd seen him quiet, the times he didn't know she was near. That was the men she'd been watching for years. He set the rail carefully. Checked it twice. Used her mallet, which he found without searching because he knew where she kept her tools the way you know a place you've loved a long time. She brought out coffee when he was done. They stood at the fence together and drank it without talking. A hawk circled over the south pasture. The wind had dropped and the morning was still for once, the mountains clear and blue as cold water. You didn't have to do that, she said. I had the timber. He looked at her sideways. She looked at the hawk. Clara. Don't, she said. Quiet. No anger in it. Not if you're going to talk yourself out of it. He shut his mouth. She took his empty cup and walked back to the house. That week he came back twice more. Once to help her shift the last of the hay into the upper loft before rain came. She hadn't asked, he'd simply seen the clouds building and ridden over. They worked side by side for 2 hours, pitching and stacking, and he learned that Clara worked with a kind of total concentration, no wasted motion, like someone who'd had to calculate the cost of effort for a long time. He respected that more than he could say. The second time he came to return her mallet and stayed for supper because she put a plate in front of him without asking, and he was not a fool. She made salt pork and cornbread and boiled potatoes, the same plain food everyone on the frontier ate, but her kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried sage, and the orange cat, she called him Murphy, after the storekeeper, which made Eli laugh, sat on the windowsill and watched them eat like a small disapproving judge. They talked about the fall cattle drive out of Lewistown. About whether the Northern Pacific line would come far enough north to matter to either of them. About her father, a little, she mentioned him easily, the way people do when the grief has aged into something they can carry. She did not mention what she'd said at the fence. Neither did he. But when he left that night, she stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind her and Murphy in her arms, and Eli rode home feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Something that sat in his chest like an ember, small, but genuinely warm. The moment came 10 days later, and it came quietly, the way real moments do. Clara had driven her wagon into Lewistown for supplies, flour, lamp oil, coffee, the nails she needed for the barn roof before winter set in hard. She was loading the wagon bed when she heard raised voices from the direction of the land office. Burkett. Land speculator out of Helena, who'd been circling the smaller homestead since spring. He'd already bought out 2 families on the Judith River, paying half what the land was worth to people who were hungry and frightened enough to take it. He had 2 men with him always, and a way of standing that reminded her of a dog deciding whether to bite. He was talking to Eli. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew the shape of it. Eli's spread sat between Burkett's acquired lots. If Burkett got Eli's land, he'd have a clean corridor to the river. Clara's 40 acres would be next. Eli was shaking his head. Burkett stepped closer. Clara set down her flour sack, straightened her back, and walked across the street. She didn't run. She wasn't afraid of Burkett, exactly, she was afraid of what fear would do if she let it show. So she walked like a woman who owned the ground she crossed, which she did, 40 acres of it, free and clear. "Mr. Burkett," she said, stepping up beside Eli. "I didn't know you were in town." Burkett looked at her the way men like him always looked at women alone, calculating, dismissive. "Miss Merritt. I was just discussing business with Mr. Kane here." "He's not selling," she said. "I wasn't asking you." "No," she agreed. "But I'm telling you anyway." She looked at Eli, not at Burkett. "Are you ready to load that timber you promised me?" "I've got the wagon." Eli looked at her for one long second. Something moved in his face, something that had nothing to do with Burkett or timber or land prices. "Yes," he said. "I am." Burkett said something else. Neither of them heard it. They walked back to the wagon together, and Eli's hand rested briefly at her back, not taking hold, not guiding, just there, and she did not move away from it. On the drive back to her homestead, the mountains ahead of them and the sky going gold in the late afternoon, Eli said, "You didn't have to do that." Clara kept her eyes on the road. "I had the words." He was quiet a moment. Then, rough and low, "Clara. I've been a fool." "Yes. I'm going to ask you something." She kept driving. Her hands were steady on the reins. Her heart was not. "I figured you might," she said. He asked her on a Sunday, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and the first snow of the season coming down in thin, soft curtains over the mountains. Not on one knee, that wasn't how it was done on the frontier, where the ground was cold and people were practical, but with a directness that she recognized, because it was the same way she'd lived her whole life. He told her he'd been afraid. He told her he'd been watching her for years and hadn't had the courage to say what that watching meant. He told her that he thought she was the most capable person he knew, and that he didn't want to fix her life because it didn't need fixing, but that he'd like to be in it, if she'd have him. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You should come in. Coffee's on." He understood that was yes. They were married in April, when the ground had thawed enough to make the ride to Lewistown comfortable. The Reverend Ames read the words in front of 12 people in the small church off Main Street. Clara wore her mother's green dress, taken in at the waist. Eli stood beside her in a clean suit that didn't quite fit across the shoulders because he'd bought it used from Murphy's store. Murphy the cat sat on the windowsill of their combined homestead that evening and watched them eat supper, the same plain food, the same warm kitchen, and seemed to find nothing worth objecting to. She kept her 40 acres in her own name. He kept his. Between them, they had 80 acres, 2 sets of hands, and the long Montana winters, which didn't seem so long anymore. It was not a perfect life. It was a real one. And real, they had both learned, was worth more than anything the land office or the cattle market or the turning years could price. She had known it for a long time. He had finally caught up. That was enough.